Good evening and welcome. On behalf of our team, Danielle Shakowski, Andy Fishoff, Annalise Rogers, and Pranathi Birapunini, I'm Donna Smith, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this panel discussion concerning the spread of hate rhetoric and crimes. The Social Justice Resource Center is committed to exposing this type of hate in our communities, especially when it manifests itself in the systems that have historically impacted people of color: education, policing, the courts, and prisons. We are joined here today by our panel who will help us to understand how this supremacy is impacting our society and what steps we can take to heal. Dr. Kathleen Blee is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. Much of her scholarship is based on analysis of her up-close ethnographic observations and interviews with white supremacists in the United States. She has served as a pro bono consultant advisor on violent extremism to numerous civic, religious, and governmental bodies, including the armed forces, police, and security agencies, U.S. congressional committees, synagogues and churches, educator forums, and schools. Jayme Jenkins is a Duquesne University clinical psychologist PhD candidate, therapist, and researcher. The focus of their current study is culturally therapeutic approaches to exit from supremacism and domination society. And our moderator tonight is Reverend Tim Smith from Center of Life, a community empowerment organization, and our sponsoring agency. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Danielle to please give us instructions on how to ask questions during the discussion.
Good evening, everyone. So you can ask any questions you may have for the panelists in the Q&A box. The chat is disabled. We are taking all of our questions through Q&A. If we do not get to your question this evening, our panelists have agreed to take a transcript of those questions and answer them, and then we can email them to you along with the recording of this webinar later on during the week. And that is also a warning that we are recording. Nobody's faces or names are visible on the recording, so you do not need to worry about that. And I just want to let everyone know that we are aware we're discussing sensitive topics this evening, so please be mindful of that and respectful in the chat. Thank you and enjoy our panel.
I had to unmute myself. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Again, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Donna, and thank you to Dr. Blee and also to Jayme Jenkins for joining us for this very, very, very important discussion. We're going to start off with some questions that we're going to ask both of our panelists, starting with Dr. Blee. Dr. Blee, right-wing extremism is bold and out of the shadows. Tell us a bit about right-wing extremism, what causes it, and why it is proliferating now.
Sure. Thank you. Actually, that's a really well-formulated question, because I think that it's exactly correct. It's out of the shadows. It's not that it suddenly has appeared and didn't exist anymore. It's more visible, but not necessarily new. So why the causes of right-wing extremism are complicated, but I would say they boil down to two things that we see at play here. It's a phenomena that is based on people's anger and sense of grievance. That's very well known, and people talk about that a lot. But the other thing it's based on is people's sense of fear. It's a response to sort of a collective fear, in this case, fear largely in the white population. And it proliferates for two kind of different reasons. One is that it proliferates because it's pushed. There are organized, structured groups and movements and leaders that push this. And so what can appear to be just a bubbling up of white supremacism, it is the product of an organized push, and an organized push that follows a very clear pattern from the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War to today. Identify an issue, point that is of concern to people, so that could be, crime, environment, cost of living, whatever. Target a group of people who you say are causing the problem. That's almost always people of color, Jews, and so forth. And then make a claim that changing that is an urgent matter and that people have to rally to change it. That's the sequence that always happens. It's very important. The other thing, the other way that it's generated is, and you see this particularly now, is it's self-generating. So social media has become a forum where just a little bit of a start, a little bit of a yeast of hatred popped into a social media chat can create a discussion and a culture that essentially accelerates itself. And so partly it's an organized push by right-wing extremists, and partly they just get it started and it rises on its own. And right now we're seeing the combination of both of those causes.
Dr. Blee, thank you for that. Dr. Blee, could you talk just a little more about the fear and where that comes from?
So I think it's important to think about fear as not something that people have. this kind of fear, but this is a fear that's generated. So this is not the case that people are sitting around, inherently fearing other people, but it is a process of identifying enemies and making people fear those enemies or fear those phenomena. So immigration is a great example. So targeting immigrants is a way of generating fear that whites are going to be displaced, that salaries are going to go down, that the whites are going to be numerically the minority. All those kinds of fears are not things that people just think of themselves. These are manipulated, manufactured fears. So I think it's important when we think about people's anger or fear that we realize that these are manipulated grievances and manipulated fears, and they're manipulated in the most viciously racist direction.
Thank you. This next question is to both of you. The Social Justice Resource Center focuses on 4 systems: education, policing, the courts, and the prisons. Is there any evidence that right-wing extremism has infiltrated these systems? And when we talk about education, just to be clear, we're talking about substandard education.
Do you want me to start?
Either one. Why don't we start with Jayme?
Oh, thanks. I'm definitely more of a novice compared to Kathy, but I can take a swing at it. In the research that I've looked at, the answer is yes. And there was actually a really pretty solid report that came out in 2006. The FBI released a report titled "White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement Represents a Significant National Threat." And the author of that report listed just dozens of instances where police officers, different enforcement agencies, there was active recruitment going on within the agencies, but also active violence being taken up. So not only were people within law enforcement agencies using law enforcement agencies to actively recruit, they were actually using their positions to terrorize communities of color. There was an example in Los Angeles where the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department formed a neo-Nazi gang and habitually terrorized the Black community. There was an example in Chicago where a Chicago police officer connected to the KKK was found to have tortured over 100 Black male suspects. So we know that's true based on this report. From my own experience, my family is very far right. Several of my nephews joined the military, and Facebook's a weird place to be. And the things I see them posting, I can tell they were always going to be a little bit right-wing, but once they joined the military, it became significantly more targeted, violent. The narrative shifted and became more sophisticated in the worst possible way, more internally consistent, more conspiracy theories, and specifically more racist, specifically racist. And so that was a personal thing I noticed. Then, we have situations like, we know the Department of Homeland Security has targeted Muslim populations over white supremacists, even though there was an FBI agent who worked with right-wing extremists for 20 years, and then he ended up quitting and just doing all this whistleblowing. And he basically said that even though the findings show that right-wing white supremacists are equally as have caused as much death in the form of like actual human life, except for 9/11, as Muslim activists, Muslim activists are prosecuted 80 times more. It's just a ridiculous difference. And anytime we make a move to give law enforcement, specifically the Department of Homeland Security, more leeway to combat right-wing supremacism, what we're really going to end up getting, that power, his belief is that power is then going to be used, actually it's more likely to be used against communities of color. So it's, we're in a complicated double bind there. And then there's another finding that police cadets who join, so if they gave them some surveys before they join and then surveys after, their amount of endorsed right-wing authoritarianism skyrocketed just from being in the police academy. So there's something about that environment that's like a substrate for these ideas. And I have some ideas why that we can get to later, but there is something about it that seems to just be a really nice environment for those ideas to grow.
Thank you, Jayme. Dr. Blee?
So let me piggyback a little bit on some of the things that Jayme said. So I think the military and the police are kind of working in different, racism is working in different ways in those. And so like Jayme said, I think in the police, there's always been some level of infiltration by white supremacists, but it's not all that easy to infiltrate the police compared to the military. I think in the police department, what you see more often is what she's describing, that there are racist cultures within the police department that seek out white supremacists, as opposed to white supremacists deliberately infiltrating the police. It probably doesn't matter in terms of its effect, but it matters in terms of the policy. I think she's exactly right that the racist culture, subcultures within the police department are we've seen over and over, just really a terrible problem, and kind of identifying individual police as the problem is absolutely missing the extent to which the racist behavior of those individual police is being nourished and cultivated and applauded and cheered on by cultures of racism within a lot of our police departments. The military sort of is, as Jayme saying, is a little different in the sense that there are certainly racist cultures within the military. On the other hand, the military itself is more, racially diverse. But the military has been deliberately targeted by organized right-wing extremists for infiltration. And they want to infiltrate it because they want their people to have weapons training, and they want to smuggle high artillery weapons out of the military for use in right-wing extremism. So the military, as opposed to the police, have been more proactive at the higher levels in trying to, in worrying about this issue of infiltration, which has gone on for decades. I was involved in this, 20 years ago, so that's been a concern. I want to make move to the issue about prisons that you raised, because that's really interesting, and it's different for men and women. So for men, prisons, for white men, can be a very radicalizing place, and the Aryan Brotherhood is the most commonly known white racist gang in the prisons, and it's a gang that radicalizes, that brings whites into racist extremism in large numbers, and has outreach outside of the prisons. Interestingly enough, that's not the case for women. There are not white racist women's gangs in prison in any extent. And in fact, for women, white women going into prison who are themselves racist, prison can be a de-radicalizing experience, because they actually come to live with women of color, and often to find them bonds of friendship across race. So it works sort of differently for men and women.
Thank you. Next question is, to what do you attribute the increase in EBS and supremacy activism over time? In supremacy, in the supremacist movement over time, how do we attribute how it ebbs and flows, and how it increases or decreases?
Jayme, do you want to go? You want me to start?
Jayme?
It's up to you. I mean, I'm a little curious what you have to say, because I have a feeling you know a lot more, especially about this one, but I'm also happy to start.
Well, I'll jump in real briefly. So I would say right now there's a whole bunch of factors that have caused this acceleration. one is the rebranding. There's been a real effort among white supremacists to rebrand themselves as not white supremacists. So they use words like alt-right, which is, let's be clear, their word, and it's meant to hide the extent to which we're really talking about white supremacists when people talk about them as alt-right. You know, the Proud Boys, people who claim they're not racist, but, you know, obviously have a completely racist agenda. It's become more global. White supremacy in the United States used to be very nationalistic and didn't have many global ties. Now they have a lot of global ties. It's obviously getting resources from Europe and Russia. It's much more penetrated into mainstream culture than it used to be. So there are even clothing brands sold in regular clothing stores that are racist branded. It has more women in it than it ever did. That's not something we as women can be proud of, that's for sure. I mean, it's become partly it has more women, and women are helping that movement penetrate more into sort of daily life. And it's become much more tied into this theory of accelerationism, which is chaos for chaos sake. So just random bombings, random violence, not even necessarily targeted at people of color, to try to kind of bring down the social order and allow a second civil war in which whites would become dominant. So it is at a very, very scary place right now.
Jayme?
Yeah, thank you. Just kind of taking in what you're saying about accelerationism and how that ties into, I follow this Harvard economist, his last name is Roderick, and he has a theory that either when you have economic problems, economic downturns, and it comes along with technological shifts, this kind of like colliding of forces where you have economic issues and then these big waves of economic or technological change, you're going to see a spike in either left-wing or right-wing populism. And like what you said earlier, Kathy, he believes that what makes it turn right-wing is when these shocks, what he calls economic shocks on the population, either because employment changes because of technology, or because, you know, the global economy changes and suddenly, you know, we're in a housing market crisis, what have you. He believes that when that's displaced onto migration, you have a right-wing populist spike, and when that's displaced onto power holders, you have a left-wing populist spike. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at what's going on right now in the world when we have, you know, erosion of labor market protections, mass increases in wealth due to, I mean, we all know Jeff Bezos stuff, right? Trade liberalism has caused this big ballooning and hoarding of wealth. Unlike, well, there was one other time that this has happened. Now they're calling what we're in the new Gilded Age, because there was one other time in our history that economics has been shaped this way, and it was the end of the 1800s. We can think about some of what else was going on then, right? Like the end of Reconstruction, the instantiation of Jim Crow. And right around that same time, we had a similar, they opened up liberalism of trade, and lots of capital got diverted into very few hands. And around the same time, you had a similar upswing in right-wing populism. So it's, you know, there are a lot of possibilities, but from what I've read, this combination of the economy, technology, winner takes all markets, erosion of the labor market is a big part of it. There's also a couple other things. Arlie Hochschild is a sociologist. She talks a lot about abandonment of rural areas, how the way that the speeding up of the world, globalization has shifted rural areas. So, you know, they call it brain drain. All the smart people leave and go to college and then don't ever go back, and who's left, and how those areas have just been gutted of all resources. I think in the 80s and the 90s, we saw a mass gutting of social services, and a lot of that money got transferred directly over to carceral or like incarceration institutions and policing. The funds literally just got flipped in a lot of places. I think that has something to do with it too. I think people are pretty upset that they can't make ends meet, and that's a portion of of white supremacists. I also think we're dealing with a lot of backlash, just pure and simple backlash. Wendy Brown calls it dethroned white masculinity. People, and I think the economic stuff really goes along with it. I think about one of my cousins who's definitely far right, and he's looking at his life and he sees that his dad was able to raise an entire family and, mom stayed at home on his salary, and now he can like barely afford rent. And he's like, what is going on in my life? How did it get like this? So of course, because of the narratives and some of the right-wing populist politicians, who does he blame? Well, it's all being displaced on people of color. It's being displaced on migrants, and he's just swallowing it up. He just believes it all.
Just to add on to the point about backlash, so we chart the big uptick in white supremacist rhetoric and messages on the internet to the night of Obama's election. So it's clearly backlash against President Obama's first election, and it just accelerated since then.
I think you make a really good point when you talk about capitalism, because capitalism is one of those things that is a common thread that runs through all four of those systems that actually make them related to each other. Substandard education, bad policing, the courts, and the prisons. Kind of brings them all together. Next question. In common responses to supremacist activism, what are people doing well? What is missing? And what is unintended opposite effects?
This is Jayme's forte. So Jayme, you want to start?
How about it, Jayme?
Yeah, I could do it. I could take it. So yeah, this is a lot of where my research is right now. There are a lot of ways that people respond. There are so many ways people respond, and people, very, very well-meaning people, sometimes have unintended opposite of that. What they're doing, they think it's going to do one thing and it does the opposite. And I don't necessarily have like an exact formula, but there are some trends that I think are worth looking at. Like, we have, for instance, there is the narrative that college liberalizes, that if you send people to college, they're going to be liberal. Well, actually, a study through Yale found that if you send your kids to a elite, mostly white institution, college actually conservatizes, not liberalizes. And they think it's not to the chagrin and against the narrative of a lot of white supremacists, it's not the professors that are liberalizing kids, it's the difference. It's being around people different than them that seems to do the magic there. I think unintended opposite effects come from things like debates. The idea that people would invite a white supremacist or a male supremacist or a religious supremacist, any of these, discriminatory people, these hateful people, to debate them on purpose, to me, I don't fully understand why, because it seems to actually be a recruitment tactic for them. And we have to understand that if you invite them to a debate, they're going into it thinking, I'm going to win this debate on my terms, so this can be a recruitment opportunity for me. And what you might walk away thinking you won, well, they were saying things differently and they're saying things in a slightly coded way. And what you might think of was them being a bully or mean. The audience they were targeting actually thinks they looked tough and they looked like they should look. They looked, masculine. And that's now been a recruitment opportunity for them. So I really, think that is a problem. And that came directly from some former neo-Nazis that I interviewed for the study that I'm working on right now. And one of them explicitly spelled out to me what his strategy was when he would speak in public and how he would speak in two layers, one that was mainstreamish enough for the public and one that had coded messages for the audience he was actually intended to be speaking to. So there's some of that going on. I think what's people are doing well. I interviewed a lot of exit programs. They're former white supremacists and former Nazis who are working to counter recruit. They do amazing work. And a lot of what I've learned from them is to do it well, you can't just, debate people on the internet. In fact, you're probably going to have the opposite effect. They're going to build their defenses. You're going to help them make their arguments more sophisticated. If you really want to change somebody's mind, you have to have a real relationship. You have to care about what they think, and plant seeds of doubt instead of trying to bash them over the head with ideas, which is really difficult. There's also a tendency within the right to silo. They get very comfortable with people just like them. And so a long-term researcher, his name was Altemeyer, he suggested to infiltrate their organizations as much as possible, not to be a jerk, but just to talk and hang out and have some introduced difference and plant seeds of doubt. I mean, and I don't mean their organizations like hate groups. I mean, like, you know, a lot of right-wingers are really into environmentalism. Well, join an environmentalist group that, you know, has a lot of right-wingers and just talk to them. Churches are really good for this. He suggested churches, because the finding has been that goodwill difference and really having open conversations where you show differences of perspective has an impact that you can statistically see when they measure these things through surveys, that it will reduce the amount of discrimination and fear that people have about what's different than them. Working with youth, you've talked a lot about youth, working with youth to disrupt segregation specifically. Like, I look a lot at intergenerational transmission of these types of ideas. And what they found is kids become more resilient to their parents' right-wing beliefs and specifically discriminating beliefs, racist beliefs, when they themselves have had a lot of interactions with people different from them. Now, opposite effects, this idea of tokenism is a serious problem, because one thing that they have found is, like, let's say they're like, okay, so we need difference, so we're gonna bring in, like, you know, one Black employee. Well, actually they found that having token roles of difference in your organizations increases discrimination. If you're gonna create difference, it's gotta be real, all levels, from the top to the bottom, real representation versus tokenism, because tokenism seems to increase discrimination, whereas real representation decreases it. And I could see more, but I think that's good.
Dr. Blee.
I don't have much to add to what Jayme says, except just to underscore that white supremacism and right-wing extremism is always conspiratorial. Right now, there's a lot of media like QAnon's conspiratorial, but all right-wing extremism is extremely conspiratorial at its core, which means that presenting people with evidence never works, because part of the conspiracy is to think that whatever evidence you're presenting is not true. So I agree, you have to start with people about their own lives and not with the evidence, because that only hardens their resolve.
Exactly. Next question. We'll start with you, Dr. Blee. So many people all over the world have been working hard to address supremacism for decades. Why has it not worked yet?
Okay, I'll be blunt. I think actually the answer is pretty clear. I think white supremacism, extremism has been protected, actively protected. It's been essentially protected by the tech companies by not intervening actively in this space until recently and partially. It's been protected by politicians who have used it to their own advantage. And I think the bigger issue is that white supremacy extremism operates and flourishes because it sits on a bed of what you might call ordinary white supremacism. So it continues because we live in a society that honors, that whites honor and act upon white supremacism that's permeated into every institution in the country that seems normal and invisible to most whites. And you know, we don't get rid of white supremacism extremism without really confronting the white supremacism of our lives and our society. So I think part of the problem is that, you know, people have assumed that you could separate these and you could just kind of go after the white supremacist extremism and sort of move that away, but it's constantly nourished and it's constantly hidden by the white supremacism of the society. So it's something that has to be confronted across the border, we just don't make any headway. It just, to go back to your opening statement, Reverend Smith, it just hides. It hides in daily white supremacism, and then it can pop out and be visible. And then if it's attacked, it'll just go hide back inside ordinary, I'm calling ordinary white supremacism, the white supremacism of our lives. And we have to attack that whole fabric.
Absolutely. Jayme.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think what Kathy was just talking about is something I write about extensively in my dissertation, because really what we're looking at here is, I get really frustrated with the language of extremism sometimes, and I know there's some necessity for it when you're working with policing and when you're looking at these fringe movements. It's real, but I think the everyday white supremacism, the everyday religious supremacism, West is best, cultural supremacism, is more detrimental because it acts out in the open and it creates policies that devastate people. Like mass incarceration wasn't created by fringe supremacists on the shadows. It was created by white supremacist policies that were enacted in the light of day. This is some of the most detrimental things that have been by people wearing suits who have fancy offices that the state pays for. When we look at, I don't know if y'all have heard of the Southern strategy, but I'm from the South, so I get a little bit amped up when I think about this, but there was a recording that got released of one of the main thinkers behind the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy was used by Nixon, Reagan, several politicians. And it was what came out in this recording was it was explicitly codifying racist policies through language of economics after the legal, they legally said you can't do Jim Crow laws anymore. We're going to stop segregation. This is just what you got to do. And so they got together and thought through how to codify these policies into the language of economics so it would fly under the radar. So like what Kathy said earlier, they're just going, they're purposefully making themselves more marketable for a mass audience. And that's all the way back to Nixon. And I'm sure probably at different points other than that. So I think that's a big part of it, is this idea that it is out of the shadows, but it's also hiding right in front of us all the time. And I wish there was more conversation about that everydayness. Even in my therapy practice, the amount of racism I hear, because whoever the client is thinks we're on the same page and we have agreement about certain things. And it's amazing what people say. And I've been using some of the techniques I've learned in this project to work with them. And it's been really wonderful, actually, the difference that can be made in those settings. I also think there's something that makes a lot of us want to, when we see danger and violence, instantly move to policing as the answer. But I don't think you can police away this problem. It's a cultural problem. It's a problem of ideas and hearts and minds. And I don't think that can be policed away. I specifically don't think it can be policed away when we're dealing with a situation where the law enforcement and the enforcement offices in general are deeply entrenched in white supremacism, and further are the types of environments that, again, are the substrate for it. A handful of researchers found that when you have hierarchical top-down organizations with very little wiggle room that uses harsh tactics, you will have more discrimination, period. And I think there's something about all the law enforcement agencies having these really intense top-down structures where there's no wiggle room and no way to advance unless you're going through the person above you. I think there's something about hierarchy there that's a really important to think through. I also think the idea that you can lock people up and throw them in jail and that's going to change their minds, we know that that's not true. So why do we keep doing it? Even after the Capitol was stormed, what did I hear so much of? We need a new domestic terrorism statute. We need to lock them up. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't face consequences. Of course they should. But I was instantly interested in why there wasn't another narrative about how we were going to make cultural changes that shifted the kind of split in the country that we're seeing right now, where half the country supported some degree of what they were seeing. And the last thing I'll say, one of the main conclusions I've come to, I have noticed that when it comes to creating discrimination, creating social hierarchies, creating cultural hegemony that is deeply discriminating, there is force at every level of society, individual, institutional, cultural, billions of dollars over decades, over centuries to make these changes happen, to seep them into the bones of people. When we're going to try to do that change in the reverse, we throw maybe $100,000 at it, cross our fingers and hope, and if it doesn't work, we're like, well, that didn't work, guess we can't change this. And I'm really coming to the conclusion that if we want mass change to happen, we have to do change in the way that it was done in the first place and put in the same investment and be willing to put in the same investment that got us into this position to get ourselves back out of it.
You know, you bring up such a really good thought process when we talk about the whole in plain sight factor, because we've seen down through the years, just in things as trivial as football, you know, football teams that are rooted for, like the Redskins or even the Chiefs, you know, these teams are, you know, in plain sight. You have people cheering for them and going crazy and paying all this money to come to these games when there's racism right in front of them, and it's operating all around them. I just think it's a very interesting point. And I also see it as well in underserved communities. You have underserved communities that have been underserved for generations, where people will stand up for their community, but they don't understand how the city government is discriminating against that community by not allowing necessary and essential funding and resources to come into that community so that people can be able to live differently and get the best education and everything like that. But it's all very much, like you say, very much in plain sight. Thank you for that. Our next question, and we'll start with Dr. Blee. Interventions are needed at the individual, institutional, and cultural levels of society. What interventions are working at each of these levels, and what is needed? What can the average person do? People are always asking the question, what can I do? You know, so.
Okay, that's a huge question. I would say, what can the average person do? The average person, whoever we are, call out racism and white supremacy all the time. I mean, I think going back to the theme that's come up a lot, this has to be out of hiding. It has to be called out, said explicitly, labeled as such. I think we have to move away from whatever, you know, polite words we're using to describe it, and just, you know, whether it's in a conversation with one's best friend, in a meeting, in a city council, you know, I think it can't be visible. It has to be visible, and it has to be made visible. On the societal level, one thing I'm concerned about is how many people in the last few years have been exposed to white supremacist content. We don't have numbers, but I think it's clearly toward 1 million people, and including a lot of children, because white supremacists have penetrated deeply into children's games, online games, which in a pandemic year, that's what kids were playing, online gaming. So the ADL did a study over a year playing just basic kid games, you know, with no racial overtone to the game. 20% of kids were approached by white supremacists while playing the game. We can't just walk away from those 20%. That's a lot of kids. That's a scary time bomb out there. So one of the things I think we need to do is, in a very scaled up way, have a public health kind of campaign. Just say, here's the warning signs. Parent, teachers, coaches, ministers, you see a kid that's saying, talking about X, doing these kind of things, this is a warning sign, and here's what you need to do to intervene. Because, I mean, we're in a bad state right now, and we could be in a worse state because of all the kids that were exposed to this during the pandemic. We've got to make the tech companies really follow through on the kind of interventions. There's things called like Moonshot, CVE, Moonshot Countering Violent Extremism, which is creating redirection. So you search for, Hitler, and it takes you to an article about the history of Germany instead of, a neo-Nazi website. I mean, we've got to get serious about cracking this proliferation of hate that's happening online, among other things.
Jayme?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that is such a good point. And I'm thinking about, my nephew's playing all these, games with adult men. And I was talking to my sister-in-law about it. And, it's amazing. She won't let them be on the internet unsupervised, but they're playing video games unsupervised. And just the lack of awareness that that's a place where there are also dangerous people, totally unknown. I don't think parents really have any idea what they're facing there. They think everybody's still doing Mario Kart. And that's just not what these games are anymore.
So I just want to jump in to correct. So when I was talking about people being reached by white supremacist content, I think it's important to realize this is happening in two forms. So these are white kids who are being enlisted, and these are kids of color who are being brutalized, right? So the intervention is needed on both sides of this. So sorry, Jayme.
Oh no, that's a great point. It's a great point. And when I think through, how this, so those are some really specific examples and they're awesome. And I want to think about how sometimes we try to do interventions and they don't work. And what do we do then? Because I see that over and over again in my research. An example I really like to use is have you all heard of Ban the Box? It was a big initiative. It was widely praised, it was grassroots, Obama signed it, everybody cheered. And then a couple of years later, we found out actually, when they got rid of that box, what happened is employment of young Black men went down, not up, because individuals took over where the box left off. And when employers no longer had that box to rely on, they made sweeping judgments about who was more likely to be criminalized. So who they started hiring was educated Black women and older Black men and young white men. So in that moment, you have an unintended opposite effects, like whoops. And what was most troubling to me wasn't the unintended opposite effect. I'm like, oh, we can think of more strategies for that. It's the number of people I saw that said, see, interventions don't work. Policies will never fix anything. That instant move toward, okay, it didn't work, let's give up now. And I was thinking, man, if the racists 100 years ago were that easily swayed by their stuff not working, we wouldn't be where we are. But that's not how it has ever worked when the changes toward discrimination and toward consolidation of power into dominant groups. They just keep trying and trying and trying until it works, right? And we see this, the 60s did great things for people, and then backlash, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and it was pervasive and it didn't stop. So I think there's got to be a way that we need to shift our mindset to assume our interventions are sometimes not going to work the way we thought. It doesn't mean they can't work. We need to look at those, quote, failures or back steps and think, okay, so then what else is needed? So now it looks like in Ban the Box, we did a policy change, and actually we needed to augment that with individual changes too. We need to be having people going into areas where there's a lot of discrimination and talking to employers. We need policies at the employer levels. We need, affirmative action. A lot of different things could also come with this. We need more interventions at different levels happening at the same time, a wider net. And I think at the individual level, we've kind of already talked about it, private conversations face-to-face, exposure to difference. We know therapy does change people's personalities. A lot of this stuff has been with them for their whole lives. How is that different than a personality? But we know it can be changed. And I think we can do that as a culture if we have the right kind of mindset about it. At the institutional level, I think some moves have been made to enact diversity training and sensitivity training. And again, there have been findings that, you know, it's an $8 billion industry now, and there have been findings that it doesn't always work. And so everybody's like, well, diversity training and sensitivity training doesn't work, so we better stop doing that. Well, actually, there are really good findings that it works really well, actually, if it comes along with institutional change, if it comes along with hands-on skill building, if it comes along with transparency and you are monitoring change over time, it can be incredibly effective. What doesn't work is when you send your employee into a room to watch a screen because they got in trouble for making a racist comment, and you give them an hour sensitivity training and expect them to be a reformed racist. No, that doesn't work. But it's the failure on some levels causes people to just so quickly say that an intervention is no longer viable and to just drop it and move away and to feel demoralized. And I think we need to really push against that kind of knee-jerk giving up to make change happen over time.
You know, you both have given us so much to think about, and in particular, you've given us several different ways of looking at these issues, which I myself personally really appreciate. It's really good to be able to look at these things from different angles. And I know that we have questions in the chat, and Danielle is going to be managing those questions for us right now.
So a question in the chat is, how can we start a conversation when people do not identify as extreme right-wing or white supremacists, but are in denial that racism exists or is a real problem?
I'll jump in, and Jayme has a better answer. I think it's not useful to try to engage people in the discussion of, are they a racist or not a racist? I mean, however people want to think about that is very hard to get around. I do think it's very important to engage white people on topics of race. And I think one of the best ways is to engage people in a discussion of the need for reparations. That just gets to exactly the heart of structural racism in the society, because for white people, it's often just a mind-blowing concept. Reparations, what does that mean? But talking through that is a way of really talking through the imprint of slavery and, you know, and the racial violence and exploitation, et cetera, of the history of this society and how much it's baked into society. So my thought is, move away from if somebody feels like they're a racist or not a racist, and let's talk about the real issues. And a real issue on the table, I think, is the case for reparations. And I think it's a discussion that needs to be had.
Mm.
Jayme?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Danielle, could you remind me the wording of the question?
Sure. So the question was, how can we start a conversation when people do not identify as extreme right-wing or white supremacists, but are in denial that racism exists or is a real problem?
Thank you. So my first question would be, who is that conversation being started with? What setting is it being started in? And what's the goal of it? Are we talking about a conversation over the Thanksgiving table? Are we talking about a conversation with a stranger in the street, with your students? Are we talking about a conversation with somebody you've never met on the internet? I think each of those has very different answers. Very different answers. I think anytime you're in public, and I'll borrow from one of my participants for the current dissertation. He talked about a scenario where he believes, and he made a very good point or a very good argument, that when you are going to be engaging a racist, a white supremacist, a Nazi, male supremacist, whoever you're engaging on the internet because they're saying some nasty things, you should not be trying to change their mind because you're not gonna in that setting. Done deal. You should be trying to counter recruit the audience. And that means fighting them. And that means only fighting them if you can win, because there's no changing that person's mind in that setting. That's not what they're there for. And they're so defended against that. There's really nothing you can say. And actually, the softer you seem and the more generous you seem in the conversation, the more you're helping them counter recruit, because it makes it seem like they're besting you. And if you let them take cheap shots and you're just respectable about it and move on, you are showing their audience that they're a good macho man who can really get away with stuff. And you're showing the kinds of people interested in their philosophies that, you know, they can bully. And that's what the types of people drawn to them want to bully. So you're helping them. So if you're, you know, that's that kind of setting. If you're in a private setting with someone you know, it's literally the opposite. And this is where it gets confusing. Because if you're in a private setting with someone you know, you actually maybe want to let them take some cheap shots and take them on the chin and move on. You want to be a good listener. You want to be interested in what they have to say and look for places where you can just make little shifts. Like Kathy was saying, if you go and calling people a racist, you just basically sealed the box. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to point out racism. And like Kathy was saying, you want to point it out everywhere you see it, especially in public. If people are doing things in a public arena, you're not going to change their mind there. But we have to also catch these things and make sure it's known that this is happening and confront it when we see it, because there are bigger things at stake than that one person's mind. If you're in a private setting with a student, you can have all kinds of conversations you couldn't have otherwise. So I think looking at things by who the conversation is with, what the setting is, and what strategies are going to work given what you're dealing with is a really important starting point.
I have a question, Danielle, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead. There's actually no more questions in the chat.
This would be for both of our panelists. So it sounds like in most of your responses to the questions that a good bit of what you're suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, is different kinds of cultural shift that needs to happen. I think am I on the right track? Because there are things that what you're talking about really sounds to me like there are various kinds of cultural shifts that need to happen, but how do we bring those things to bear on a culture where racism and white supremacy is so baked in, you know, like even the examples of, when we talk about the examples of reparation. So reparation, for some reason, seems to be so hard for some people to understand. However, it tends to be a thread for how we handle litigations. You know, like we want to make people whole. We want to repair whatever the breach is or whatever the break is. We understand repairs in that area, but we don't understand reparations when it comes to people of color. So I'm just interested in knowing more about, you know, what you all may think is the most effective ways of bringing about cultural shift. You know we need numbers, but I just wanted to kind of put that question out there.
So I guess I would, since I'm a sociologist, I'll have to say this. I think cultural shift is really important, but I also think we have a deep need for political and economic shifts of a huge magnitude. And race is so baked into our politics and our economy. I think we're getting a little bit better at calling that out. So now voter suppression is now talked about as voter suppression and talked about this as a racial strategy. I think that's a good advance. But, you know, so much about, you know, as you were talking before, Reverend Smith, about capitalism and the way the economy, has white advantage baked into that. We need to start identifying that, making it clear this is a problem and a racial problem, and extricating ourselves from that kind of, you know, racial injustices in our political system and our economic system, as well as in our culture.
Economics. My chair and I have been in disagreement about how much economics should be allowed to have room in my dissertation, because it's a lot right now. And she'd like me to slim it down, but it's very hard for me to do, because I, you know, especially looking at the diagramming I've done of the first Gilded Age and now, and how similar they are, and how they both came after a period of opening all the borders and liberalizing trade and switching the way that there's a thing called distribution. So you send all the goods out and then the money comes back. Well, it comes back through bottlenecks. And the people who get it at those bottlenecks, financialists, globalists, they keep it, a lot of it, and they don't redistribute it to the little guys, to the workers, to small businesses, to domestic businesses. In Europe, we have redistribution through really powerful social welfare systems that, you know, you get 2 years off the moment you have your first child. Everybody just gets 2 years off work. The government pays for it. You know, that's how they redistribute. In the US, we have nothing like that. No safety nets whatsoever. And I think Kathy's right that the way the economic system is built in the current climate, it basically says, if you are economically not doing well, it is your personal failure. And if you are doing well, it's because you were also personally successful and you did a great thing. And there's no room for born into it. There's no room for discussions of entitlement. It's all based on your personal merit or your personal failing. And I think that's kind of entrenched in the economic system. And I'm an anthropology BA and have gotten some of this thinking through my early education in anthropology before now. But it does seem like social organization follows economic organization, because that's how we get what we need. And when we think about getting our needs met, well, now we call that economics, but it's also just, you know, providing for ourselves. And if we have an economic system that is entrenched and intrinsically based in discrimination, and some winners take all and some people win and some people lose, how can we expect anything other than what we have right now?
And yeah.
There's another question in the chat. It is, how are white women in particular contributing to white supremacy?
So white women have been in white supremacy for a long time, certainly at least since the 1920s Ku Klux Klan, which had a very large and somewhat autonomous women's Klan. They've been kind of fluctuating in and out. Women are now really growing in all areas of right-wing extremism and white supremacy. And they contribute in all kinds of ways, including in violence. But I would say one of the most powerful and, one of the most powerful roles is that women tend to quote, normalize white supremacy. Women are really effective recruiters because they can seem less extreme in their appearance, and they're better at pulling people out of the mainstream white population than men are often. And so women almost never have titles as leaders in white supremacist groups, but women often perform leadership roles. And one of those leadership roles is recruiting, building the group, keeping the group together, those kinds of things. So it's another scary phenomena that's going on in white supremacism right now, the growth of women in those movements.
You know, I don't have an academic answer for this, but I do have my personal experience. Something that didn't make it into the document I'm working on right now, but that I wrote this vignette that's basically called the racist grandma metric. And when I was looking at what works and what wouldn't work, I was thinking about my two grandmothers that are very, very differently racist. The one grandmother is from northern Indiana state, and she probably has never been around a person of color for more than 2 seconds. And the one time I was with her when she was rude, would whisper things, would tell you what exits you shouldn't get off of. Just her method of dealing with her racism was just total segregation. She moved from Gary, Indiana, white flight, small white area. In the area I grew up in, there are signs, Knight's Coffee Cup, KKK. There's no coffee cup place. Knight's Carpet Cleaning, KKK. Outside of a residence, there's no carpet cleaning business. You know, this is the area she chose to live and have her family. She felt safer there. And when I think about intergenerational transmission of white supremacy, I think of her, because that was the choice she made. And when I see the racism in some of my siblings and my cousins, I think about what has manifested that, and what would have been different if she had stayed in the city and hadn't taken the white flight out, and what led her to do that in the first place. And some of the very coded and quiet ways that she transmitted racism. And then I think of my other grandma who has used she's from the South. She's used racial expletives. It was, just part of my growing up with her. Also, owned a store and had black friends, and was around a lot of people different from her. And even though she was more racist in this old-fashioned Southern way, she also cared deeply for other people. But she also transmitted racism. She believed that white people were better, and she just did, it was just part of who she was as a person, but didn't transmit hate in the same way. So I think it's complicated because they both transmitted racism to their children and their grandchildren, and they did it in such different ways. And I think that women are uniquely positioned to be center points of intergenerational transmission of racism. And it's a responsibility people who are going to have children need to think through, that your ideas are going to get transmitted. But I do think, especially in the case of my northern grandmother, the way she transmitted it was so much more quiet, but it actually was more effective. And I think it is because that total segregation was more effective. Whereas in the South, most of my grandmother's grandchildren have, a variety of friends, and some of those sentiments didn't get transmitted in the same way. So, I guess that's all I really have to say to that. But I do think women have a unique responsibility when it comes to intergenerational transmission that we need to be serious about.
You mentioned economics, and I was thinking when you think about, there's a book out that's called, this was out a while ago, called The Color of Wealth. And when you think of the economics around the way our country, marginalized the people of color, Native Americans, from that standpoint. And when people talk about this idea of how do we make things equal, all things equal, how often do you all have to kind of wrestle with that particular question from an academic standpoint? Because that's a very intricate journey right there. Because it's not like it assumes that everybody starts off on the same, at the same level, but we know that is not true. So could you just address that a little bit for us?
I would say that's an issue that comes up in classrooms a lot. That's how certainly white kids learn to think about equality as just everybody probably started out equal, and so everybody needs to have equal treatment. And I think you're exactly right. It's part of the journey to think through why that isn't equal. And that really gets into some deeper ways of thinking about what the society is like, and the legacies that we inherit from previous generations, and of injustice and our current forms of injustice. I do think that really gets to the heart. That's probably a really good question to talk to people about right off, because that really moves exactly into the heart of what we mean by structural racism and white supremacy, being baked into all levels of our society. So equal turns out to be a much more complicated concept when you think of it that way.
Yeah, because it's not a matter of income. It's more of a matter of generational wealth and how that was accumulated. But please, Jen.
Yeah, it's such a complicated question and such a good one. And I've also dealt with it most in the classroom when I've been teaching. I think it's pretty easy to give examples of how people don't start out equal. What's been harder for me to talk to people about is how we can't all get equal really quick if we wanted to, but everybody has a fair shot, that kind of like pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Everybody can make it if they try hard enough. I've taken different tacks. Sometimes I use a lot of stats, like, no, but this. Often I wonder, I try to get at, and I sound like a broken record, but what is the person intending with those questions? Where are they starting from? And I've often tried to interrogate what's underneath, because usually they have a reason they're asking questions like that. And there's something about the world they want to understand better if they're asking the question. So I usually try to carefully and respectfully get at exactly the bias that they have and kind of start from there.
So I just thought of an example. I used to teach at University of Kentucky. And so students would often say, well, I'm from Appalachia and, it's white, they're all white, it's poor. But that's a really interesting thing to think about, because Appalachia didn't used to be all white. Appalachia was made white. Appalachia was a racially diverse part of the country, and the Black population was pushed out, lost their land, stripped of their land rights, stripped of their coal, mineral rights, and salt rights. Salt was big in that area, and pushed out. So, people think about this is a white area. No, that was an area made white by exclusion and expulsion. And I think those are the conversations that we need to have, and not just with white kids. Kids of color in Kentucky thought the same thing. That there had never been people of color in Appalachia. That history has been removed for racial reasons, but it's been removed from everybody's knowledge.
Dr. Kathleen Blee, Jayme, Jenkins, you all have given us a lot to think about, and we can't thank you enough for joining us tonight for this discussion. It's been a very rich and rewarding discussion, and we hope that we can continue the conversation, and not just in this setting, but in other settings that are absolutely essential, where these things need to be heard and talked about. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And I just want to point out that the Social Justice Resource Center does have an Instagram. You can follow us at Social Justice PGH. We will be updating you all on events and some other things going on throughout the city through there. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.